All right. I see that we already have a pretty good number of attendees who have joined. So I think to make sure we get through all of our content today, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. I'm sure a few people will continue to file in, and that's perfectly fine. So hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Help Wanted, Variation in Skills, Pay, and Job Descriptions Across Local Election Offices. My name is Danny Davenport. I'm an election expert with the Elections Group, and I'll be your host today. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Elections Group is an election administration consulting firm. We partner with state and local election officials to improve processes for election officials and for voters. Before we begin today's webinar, the Q&A feature is open for audience members to ask questions. We will have a dedicated Q&A section towards the end of the webinar. And if for some reason your question does not get answered today, we encourage you to follow up via email, and you can do that at support@electionsgroup.com. In the past, there has been very little research on the American elections workforce, especially those roles beyond the chief election official. As a result, there's a lot about the election workforce that we do not understand. For example, how have salary ranges changed for election staff over the last 10 years? What is the relationship between jurisdiction size and employee pay? And how would one even go about compiling data on the elections workforce? Well, I am so fortunate to have two outstanding guests on screen today who have done research to answer exactly those questions and many more. So without further ado, let me introduce our two guests. Will Adler is the Associate Director for the Elections Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and Paul Manson is a Research Assistant Professor at the Mark O. Hatfield School of Government, Center for Public Service. Will, Paul, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us. I think what we'll do is we'll start out, I'll introduce some of the background pieces from some survey research, and I'll hand it off to Will, who's done some real magic to get into some of the details that have been sort of elusive, as Danny hinted at. So again, my name's Paul Manson, and I wear a couple of hats. One of them is here with Portland State University, the other with Elections and Voting Information Center, which is a partnership with Reed College. For election officials, you may have been fortunate or unfortunate, depending on your perspective, to have received a survey from us in the years past, asking questions about administering elections, including some workforce pieces. Our survey work has really struggled to try to make sense of what's happening within pay, staff structures, and office structures. And so what I'll do is I'll start out talking a little bit about what we have in our data from the survey, and then hand it off to Will, who really takes it a step further using some really innovative tools to understand what's happening out there in the world. So I want to start out with just sort of an overview piece. One of the key things we like to share is the diversity of the size of offices in the US. And I think this will come into play as we have a conversation later on. A lot of jurisdictions in the US are very small, and they may have small in terms of total registered voters, and they have small staff then to match. It's when we get above 50,000 registered voters, 100,000 registered voters, that you start to see a little bit more variation. But even in that, the top two bands there, that light green is 2 to 5 in the 100 to 250,000. So we can still see that like a third of those larger offices may have very small staff. And so there's some dynamics there that we really want to understand. And our survey tries to get at some of those pieces. But I think that influences the conversations about hiring and the barriers for finding staff that will fit into these offices appropriately. We also know that there's some differentiation around salary from those chief local election officials. Now, I should pause here for a moment. Will share, I think, more detailed data than we have. We, in our survey over at EVIC, focus on the local election official that's in charge of that office. And so the salary bands here that I'm sharing really are for that chief officer. We don't know, from our data at least, what's happening among the staff within those offices. The takeaway here that you'll see in this chart is that recognizing that those smaller offices are predominantly staffed and led by women, that's where the pay sort of skews towards women to the left side, the lower bands. As we move to the right, men are earning more, in large part because as we move into larger jurisdictions, we see more of a 50-50 split in terms of local election officials being men and women, whereas the smaller jurisdictions, they're predominantly led by women, and being smaller jurisdictions tend to have fewer resources, and we think, therefore, that's why the pay is lower. The size of the jurisdiction that I just mentioned here really is connected with the gender component, and so women are more likely to lead these offices. What's another piece that we want to keep an eye on that I think connects to pay is thinking about what the work is within the office. One of the questions we've asked over the years is how much of their office's duty is tied to election administration, recognizing that lots of these officers across the US are clerk, recorder, auditors, various other titles. They're doing other duties. They may be managing the meeting minutes for councils, commissions, doing budget work, HR work, the recorder, transactions for real estate, in some cases managing the community, cemetery, dog licenses, wide array of tasks. Now, as we move into larger jurisdictions, what you see, of course, is that they become specialized. And so here you can think about the larger urban jurisdictions where it is an election office and it's a fully dedicated staff. And so 100% of their work, for the most part, is probably going to be elections. It's really here where you see that sort of pink or salmon colored set of dots that are lower down. It's under 25,000, those smaller jurisdictions where they're doing more diverse work across the board. Why introduce this before we start talking about the help wanted? One of the challenges that we've anticipated is sort of how we define these jobs. The job classifications, the job descriptions are really a challenge because there can be this diversity across all of these different types of offices. And so for us, the challenge is we're also asking a certain type of question. So for those of you who've taken a survey, there's certain questions that are easier than others. So we try to use a checkbox and we offer different salary bands. Do you make between 20,000, 40,000, 40,000, 50,000, and so on? That's meant to make it an easier survey. What we wish we could collect is actually, write in a number or actually know what that value is. We don't do that because that's a little bit harder. And we're also really curious about sort of the pathway into these offices, sort of how do different local election officials come into this? And we need some more granular data to understand that. And I think that's what Will share here in a moment. As we look, we've run the survey over here at EVIC since 2018. We added the salary question in 2019. And what we've seen is that it's been flat across time. And what you're seeing here are the different salary bands that I just mentioned and their trends. If anything, what we've seen is that some of the lower salary bands themselves maybe have decreased a little bit as we've seen some shifting up with inflation over time, but largely stayed flat, at least by these measures. Now, this does seem to match some other data out there on state and local pay in different offices, but that's another piece that I think we wrestle with in terms of the type of data that may not be available at the moment, is how does this compare to other county offices, other county staff and officers that may be facing a similar challenge. This is, I think, a really interesting piece. The longer you're in the office doesn't necessarily mean that you're getting paid more. Now, on one hand, I think that might be surprising from a sort of civil service job position, right? A position that's actually not appointed, is not elected, but is sort of in a civil service system. You would assume that there might be pay steps or increases that go over time. I believe this largely reflects the fact that a lot of these officials probably have pay set through either local budget hearing processes or by statute, and therefore they're sort of capped. If these are constitutional officers or if they're officers that are created in law, then the compensation may not be adjusted based on a compensation study necessarily. Though I also have heard in other conversations that those compensation studies tend to lag in terms of the type of work that clerks, recorders, auditors, local election officials are really doing. That they don't quite capture the diversity of the work. And that may also be why we see some stagnation in pay even over time. So even if you're serving longer, you're not making more, that's either going to be connected to how the position is defined in law or how these compensation studies aren't quite capturing the type of work that's going on. Now, the size of the jurisdiction does really drive pay. And so, of course, this goes back to the argument I made earlier that we think that this is tied to the resources that are available based on the size of the jurisdiction. So once we get above 100,000, or really at that 100,000 point, it was that inflection where we start to see that higher salary band really take up the proportion of offices across the US. And that makes sense in terms of what the resources that are made available for larger jurisdictions. Some of the challenges we struggle with, though, is that we're in those salary bands and we're only looking, as I mentioned, at that chief official in the office. We don't know what's happening for staff, deputies. Deputies, we'd love to know sort of what those pay dynamics are like. There may actually be some interesting dynamics we've seen, such as anecdotally, that you may have a chief official who has a defined salary in statute or law, but their deputies may make more because that's actually connected into the civil service piece. So there's some disconnects there that we want to make sense of, but we don't have sort of empirical data. we don't have some components there to really help with. So what's exciting here is Will share in a moment some of the work that was done. I'm fortunate, the Bipartisan Policy Center invited myself and some other both practitioners and researchers to join an election workforce advisory council, the EWOC. And this is one of the charges that we're working on trying to make sense of, is sort of what's the pipeline into these positions? What are the dynamics of pay? How do we do workforce development? And so the BPC's investment into asking these questions has really spurred a great conversation among that advisory council, and in turn kicked off some work by BPC themselves. And so, Will, what I'll do is I'll hand this over to you, and you can just let me know as you want. I'll advance to the next slide.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Paul, and thanks, Danny, and the elections group for hosting us and letting us present our research to you guys. Yeah, so as Paul was talking about, the survey data that he collects from local election officials is incredibly rich. It tells us all sorts of things about the dynamics of the workforce, and it's really a fantastic data set. But as Paul noted, there are a couple blind spots, and the big one, like Paul was saying, is the non-chief election officials, right? Because the majority of the workforce are probably not the chiefs, but are the rank and file staff. It's kind of interesting that it's not actually known whether that's true. And Paul Gronke has an interesting blog post about that. But yeah, there's no regular survey of non-chiefs. So to get information on pay for non-chiefs, you have to be a little bit creative. You have to scrape publicly available data sets like state or county government websites, but that's pretty labor intensive to do for all states. So there's another available source of information on non-chiefs across the country that I thought I would try to compile and analyze. So that brings us to part 2 of this talk, which is about the Election Line Weekly Job Description data set, which we released last month. Election Line is an excellent website and a newsletter that the Election Center hosts and that Mindy Moretti has edited and maintained since 2011. I'm sure that many of us here rely on it for daily or weekly election-related headlines. But it's also, to my knowledge, and I think by accident, the only archive of election job postings on the web. So Election Line has been posting election jobs every week since 2011. They look like this. These range from directors of elections all the way down to temp workers. So this is a really convenient place to try to get some broader insight into the job market beyond just the chiefs. So naturally, I wrote a program to scrape the entire contents of Election Line from the web. Even though it's all public information, I did get Mindy Moretti's blessing first on this, so don't worry about that. And Paul, if you can take us to the next slide. I also wrote a program to extract the data from the listings, and this is a sort of a depiction of how that works. The formatting of the data is not always consistent, so using traditional scraping techniques, if any of you are familiar with them, like regular expressions, did not work very well. So I instead used GPT 3.5, which is one of the engines by OpenAI that powers ChatGPT, to extract that information. And I did that by using a combination of the OpenAI API and ScrapeGhost, which is a program that leverages that API. So if none of those words made any sense to you, that's fine. This is an example of how the code takes this job description, an example job description like this one at the top, and turns it into a row in the data set, which is publicly available now. The really neat thing here is this last column, which tries to indicate whether a job description seems to belong to a chief election official or not. I asked GPT 3.5 to use various context clues to determine this, like whether the description indicates that a person reports to a board or a county director. And it does an okay, if not perfect job on this. But you can see it pulls out this information into a form that is usable by a researcher trying to understand the job market, or even an election official that's trying to write a comparable job description or something like that. So if we go to the next slide, these are some stats about the data set as it stands today. It's not a huge data set, but hopefully it can be useful to some of you. And actually, this is not the data set as it stands today. This is the data set as it stood about a month ago. It is automatically updating, and we'll share the links with you at the end of the talk. So there's actually probably 50 or so more job descriptions in each of these categories. It's updating every single day. And if we go to the next slide, this is a graph of some salary information from the data set that I was able to pull out. And this confirms more or less the finding that Paul presented to you earlier. that salaries for election officials have been basically flat for years. This data is a little bit different. It goes back to 2011, and it also includes the non-chief staff in red. I'm plotting the average salary here of the job descriptions over time, split out by whether the AI thought a description was for a chief official or not. And as you can see, we find that the mean of the posted salary ranges for election staff has increased only by about 10% in the last 10 years. The number above each point is the number of descriptions included in each point. There's not quite enough data, I would say, to draw conclusions about chiefs here. I would probably depend on the LAO survey for that, which is much more comprehensive. But still, this kind of confirms that finding. It shows that we see a similar stagnation for election staff salaries as the survey showed for chiefs. And Paul, if we go to the next slide, we can also plot the data like this to try and confirm Paul's finding that staff in larger jurisdictions are paid more, and we do. So here on the x-axis is the number of registered voters for a jurisdiction, and the y-axis is the salary. So according to these postings, a staff member in a job description with 2.5 million voters is likely to make about $100,000, while a staff member in a jurisdiction with 100,000 voters is likely to make about $66,000. One thing to note here is that this data is incredibly noisy. If you just look at the staff jobs for a jurisdiction with 500,000 voters, you can see that the salaries in that cloud of red points ranges from below $50,000 to almost $150,000, and that's for the same, roughly the same size jurisdiction. So there are still tons of other factors besides size to explore here if we're going to understand the important factors for election workforce compensation. And a lot of it is going to depend on those factors that Paul presented earlier, right? The numbers of full-time staff, how are their responsibilities split, that kind of thing. Another thing to notice here is that these numbers seem to be kind of high. So relative to the numbers Paul presented from the LEO survey, it looks like last year's chiefs made somewhere between $50,000 and $75,000 on average. But the job descriptions for these chiefs seem to be at least twice as high as that. And the job descriptions for staff are often higher as well. And so that raises the question, which is, well, why is that? And the reason is that this is a different data set. Paul's data set is attempting to be a representative sample of chief election officials, representative and comprehensive. And this is not. This is just job positions on election line, and these are positions that the employer has deemed worthy of a national online search, and these jobs might be higher paid because of that. And so that points to a larger issue with this data set is it's not necessarily a representative sample of jobs, but there's still a lot we can learn from it. And we put out a blog post last month that Danny just pasted in the chat on this data set, which gives a little bit more context on it. It's a unique data set that I hope some of you will find useful. And there are a few different ways that I think this data can be used, which I think we'll get to in a moment. So, yeah, in closing, I'll just say that this research leaves us with a lot of questions for the research community to explore in particular, like how are election officials recruited? What is the balance of temp workers, full-time election staff, and chiefs? What are the considerations for compensation? There's a lot to discuss here. It doesn't seem like there's a single data set or even two data sets, the election line one or the EVIC data set, that can answer all these questions. But we need to chart a path forward on getting a handle on these issues in order to make sure that we have a strong election workforce. So that's the end of my talk. You can go to this concluding slide, Paul, but this is a QR code that just has a link. It's the same link that Danny posted in the chat, so no need to whip out your phones. And yeah, I look forward to the discussion. I look forward to seeing what questions you guys have. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul and Will, for going through your presentation and showing your data to us and sharing your research with us. I want to start a conversation about your work now that everyone has seen the presentation. But before we do that, I would just like to remind all of our audience, we do have the Q&A feature active in the chat, which means if you have a question that you would like to ask Paul or Will or both of them, please feel free to type that into the Q&A, send it over to us. We will have a little bit of time reserved at the end of the webinar to circle back to your questions. But first, I'm going to kick us off by asking you both a few questions. So we covered a lot in a short amount of time in that presentation. I want to go back and sort of draw out some of what we discussed. And I think the first thing I want to ask, and this is for either of you, is just can you summarize sort of what the major takeaways from the research were for you? What really struck you as important? And maybe if anything surprised you in your research?
Yeah, I'll start from the local election officials survey, and I think what surprised me really was that tenure piece. How long individuals have served is not a predictor of how much they're making. And the reason I worry a little bit about that as well is, is that a sustainable trend? And I think it brings up some questions that really, one of the challenges I think in the election ecosystem is that each state has these unique systems for compensation and managing offices. But as the work is getting more complex, one thing I didn't share in the slides is that, that the number of jurisdictions saying that they're doing mostly election work is growing. I'm not sure if they're actually getting other work taken off their plate. And I know, at least in interviews that I've done with some clerics here in Oregon, the answer is no, work is not getting taken off the plate. So if we sort of see over time pay is stagnant, no matter how long you're serving, more duties are being added. Is that sustainable for this workforce going forward? And again, I'm looking there at the top official. Maybe that's not something that's happening within the staff, though. I think what Will can contribute really helps give us some hints on that.
And just to build on that, yeah, I was I think my overall reaction is just being dismayed, honestly, by the fact that both of these data sets demonstrate the same thing, the stagnation of wages in the election workforce. I think it's something that absolutely needs to be addressed as more and more responsibilities are being added to election officials' plates, as those responsibilities become increasingly technical and require increasing levels of training. Um, I see an opportunity here for some research on trying to determine whether election officials are an outlier relative to other local government officials, right? Maybe pay has been stagnant for all sorts of local government officials who may also have their duties becoming increasingly more complex and requiring specialized training. It would be really great for someone to kind of put that in context of all of these other local government fields and try to determine uh, if election officials are unique or not, and then how to use that research in order to advocate to local and state leaders to make sure that government officials are getting paid commensurate with their complex and incredibly important duties.
Well, I think that's a really good point is that we have this data now that you two have put together for us that gives us some insight into election administration workforce, but we don't know, like you said, yet exactly how that compares to other government agencies, government organizations. I'm curious, Paul will mention that he thinks that's sort of an important avenue for future research. Are there any future research projects that you either yourself would be interested in doing along these lines, or that you hope that other folks in the field will pick up from what you've learned?
So, one priority I think a lot of us have been talking about, especially among the Election Workforce Advisory Council, the BPC is hosting, is thinking about the structure of the offices, how job descriptions are being developed, how they match up to the work being done. I'm curious too, as we dive into this, when folks are being recruited, what is there a negotiation process? What is that resulting in as they're hired? And so we may see these salary ranges advertised. Are the candidates slotting into those, the high end, the low end? Are there demographic characteristics of those candidates that are driving that? Especially as we think about maybe some of the pressures on local government finance. That's another piece that's always sort of looming in the background. I think when we talk about jobs in the election space is sort of how offices are funded. Are they relying on state funds or local property tax or transaction fees at the front desk? And how does that inform some of these trend lines? And are there some opportunities there to help some of these offices sort of either modernize, update, or sort of make more current the job descriptions and the compensation structures? And that will require, I think, more qualitative work, really, to be honest. It's a hard bit of data to collect through surveys. It takes a phone call or a meeting to, I think, get to some of those pieces.
So, yeah, that's interesting that you're talking about research methods. I want to pivot a little bit. So, I want to give you both an opportunity. This is a really interesting process that both of you use separately to like perform, to like collect your data sets. So, I want to give each of you an opportunity to just talk about the methods you used, if anything that you didn't highlight that you'd like to, or just if there were any challenges you faced that you didn't expect it as you were doing your research. And we can start with either one of you.
Sure. I mean, so the work that I did is a combination of traditional web scraping techniques, where basically I was just crawling through the Election Line website and downloading every single file from Election Line Weekly. But the thing that was kind of innovative and new is using these AI-powered tools, large language models, to analyze that data, because some of the data there is kind of it's text data. It's not necessarily amenable to data processing. It's not regularly formatted. And one of the kind of interesting challenges here is writing a prompt that could get essentially ChatGPT to answer a question: does this appear to be an election official? Because there are some jobs up there that are sort of vaguely election related, but not actually election officials are not. Election administration is not some of the duties of some of the jobs in there. And does it appear to be a top election official? Um, and it's sort of like a mixed bag. You can kind of open up the Google Sheet for yourself and look. And it's something that I'm trying to refine. But this is kind of like the next frontier in terms of trying to analyze text data using AI. It's kind of a fascinating new world, and it's getting better every few months.
Yeah, it is. It's really cool to learn about how you're using sort of those natural language prompts to be more efficient and able to sort of sift through this data, at least as a first pass, in a way that we would not have been able to even just a few years ago. Paul, sort of same, just along the same lines. Is there anything about either your methods you'd like to talk about, or just any challenges you faced in doing the research?
Well, one of the really exciting pieces, I think, for the EVIC team is, we've been working on this survey since 2018. And what's always humbling as a survey researcher is to get into the qualitative piece and sit down with election officials and talk about this, because you realize how really bad I am at writing questions, or at least, my mental model of what's actually happening in these offices. So the interviews have been hugely powerful. We had a chance to conduct some qualitative work here in Oregon, and then BPC is supporting some interviews nationwide with local election officials. So as a pause here, just a note, for those of you who are election officials, you will be getting an invite likely for the 2024 local election officials survey in the next month. And you might also get a phone call from me too, depending. So hopefully that's something that you welcome. But I think what's great here is, Will's connection to some of these generative AI tools is really powerful, because one thing we can collect through the survey online, especially our open-ended responses. We ask local election officials to share in their own words challenges or policy priorities they have. And I think a limitation for us as researchers often has been sifting through a lot of that text data. And so these sorts of tools have really changed how we think about at least getting an initial pass on trends in text data, open-ended responses. And what I hope that means is actually we can have a better and more nuanced sense of the challenges facing election administration, and as a research community, move more quickly to translating those into findings through generative AI tools like what Will's developed for this effort.
Awesome. And you mentioned, so you brought up sort of like the tricky part of doing like qualitative research. So I'm going to ask a question that might be a little bit speculative, but I'm just curious if either of you has insight into this. And Paul, I think you may especially. You mentioned earlier that it would be interesting if we were able to sort of more systematically understand the pathways that lead individuals into elections work. I'm curious either if there's anything you learned that you can share with us, even if it's not necessarily like a data set, just like any sort of like first hints at the answer to that question, or if you have ideas for maybe how people could start to do more research into that question.
That's a great question. We started asking about 2 years ago in our survey a checklist of items. Essentially, where did local election officials come from prior to their work? And the answer is it's really all over. And I think it's telling, because half of local election officials in the U.S. are themselves elected to their position, and the other half are appointed or civil service positions. So for those that are elected, you would expect that that sort of looks like America. Folks that become interested in elections and might run for office. And so private sector and public sector are all in there. I think we anticipated maybe more of an overlap with some of the more traditional campaign or party side of things. There's not that. So individuals that are elected are really coming from a diverse background. We also know that within some of these elections, it's the staff themselves sort of decide it's time to make the next step. Maybe there's a retirement at that senior local election official level. One of their deputies is willing to step up and run for that office. So we know that's a dynamic as well. But I think in terms of a general sort of pipeline pattern for the what's sometimes called the apex of the office, those chief components, I think we get a sense of that dynamic. What I'm really curious about is on the Paul Grunke and I have sort of joked about there's sort of the heads and tails research on local election workforce. So the heads are the chief that we've been talking about today. The tail, not to sort of put it at the back end, but are the temporary workers, the poll workers. We sort of know what's going on there. It's the body, the folks in the middle that pipeline answer, I don't know how to answer yet. I would love to know, qualitatively, we've heard some stories about recruitment can be fruitful looking in like the real estate agencies or real estate industry because it's sort of a high compliance environment. And so you might want to recruit from high compliance industries because elections work itself is very deadline driven, very detail driven, and requires a lot of attention to compliance. But then again, we don't know that for sure. So, we're curious there. The other piece that I'm mindful of is election offices sit within county or other local government structures. And so I know there's competition across those agencies within local government. And so we're curious sort of what that movement may or may not be between, maybe library staff to county election officials to law enforcement to HR, other parts of the organization. But that's a level that we haven't been able to dive into yet.
And Paul kind of introduced the work that we at BPC are doing with the Election Workforce Advisory Council, which was really stood up to enhance and innovate recruitment, retention, and training. And recruitment it keeps coming up as a piece that is a challenge and maybe a little bit lacking, right? It's great to see that election officials come from all over, and make their way into election administration from a variety of different career paths. That's fantastic. It brings a lot of different skills to the table, means that it's just an incredibly diverse workforce. But it also means that there's an opportunity here for it's kind of a sign that maybe the field is not as professionalized as it could be in terms of recruitment, and there's a lot of work to try and build that pipeline into the field. So when we actually held a meeting in LA with with EWOC members, and this is one thing that we spent a lot of time talking about. How can we bring more people into the field who want to be election administrators? And one point of discussion was that if you look at, say, like a typical MPA, someone who goes and gets their master's in public administration, they might make their way through all of school without ever being exposed to election administration at all, thinking that it's a potential thing that they could do in their career. And that's an issue, and it's also an issue that shouldn't be too hard to fix, right? There are people on our council and people who are interested in this kind of work who have connections to people who are forming curriculums in MPA programs and such, who maybe we can build in a way to expose them to the possibility of being an election administrator and using the skills that they pick up in school to being amazing election officials. So I think there's a lot of work that we're interested in doing and that our members are doing to try to enhance the pipeline into the field.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really fascinating. I feel like we've learned so much, and it always makes us realize there's so much more that we can learn, especially like you said, elections within like the universe of public administration doesn't always get the most attention from a workforce place, and that is a bummer because it's really important that our democracy be ushered in by people who are confident, like well trained and enthusiastic about doing this work. Will, you spoke about this a little bit earlier, but I want to sort of bring us back. One thing I'm really curious about is as you two both sort of went and did your respective research, pulled together your data sets, what kind of future research did that make you interested in conducting? Again, I know, Will, you already sort of gave us a little bit of a preview, so maybe we can jump to Paul first and just see like what do you think the next steps are? What should people be asking? What questions?
I think what I'd love to hear from actually is from the practitioner community. So it was we're sharing these challenges and our findings. I know I had a short list for when we were at a meeting recently, and the questions I have for practitioners that help me ask better questions is sort of what are the practices that you're using? How do you sort of set pay, do job descriptions, do the compensation study work? What are the larger budget dynamics going on that influence those choices? And then on the recruitment side, sort of where do you go? Who do you talk to in terms of finding opportunities? I know um, there's some new fellows type programs. I'm thinking about the state of Arizona program where the Secretary of State's office is really getting involved in helping support young individuals getting into the elections field by placing them in the office and using state funds to make that happen, especially in rural jurisdictions. And so I think that's another pipeline piece. Sort of what are the best practices? What are folks being able to take advantage of? And again, I think Will's point is spot on here too. We think about these training programs, but remembering too that I think a lot of the workforce may not get to the MPA level. And so, what are the other training opportunities, whether it's certificate type programs or on the job learning pieces that help create internship programs, fellows, so on and so forth? I mean, I think it'd be fun to have sort of a discussion about a civil service sort of internship program that helps engage young individuals thinking about that next step and getting into local county government to support all sorts of work, but elections included.
Yeah, absolutely. Will, do you have any other sort of like follow-ups as far as future research avenues to pursue?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple things that I would flag. One is we actually a part of EWOC's responsibilities is we're administering a grant program to generate new research on the election workforce. We put out a press release highlighting the 9 grants that we were able to fund with the support of the Election Trust Initiative. Paul is actually doing some of that work. And we're actually hoping to publish much of this work before the election. So Paul is doing some of this research on what forces drive retention and turnover. We have, work from all sorts of other universities. I would encourage you to check out the press release that the elections group just posted in the chat on the challenges that election officials are facing, how to improve communication. So there's a whole broad set of research that we're supporting. In terms of compensation, which is kind of the stuff that we were sort of focusing on today. A big reason why Paul and I wanted to team up to do this work is because we've heard from election officials that when they're advocating for pay for themselves and pay for their staff, it's important to have some comparables, right? What are election officials in other states and other jurisdictions being paid, and what would be an appropriate amount for me to be paid, or my deputy, things like that. But it's very hard to know what that means, right? What should election officials and staff get paid? How do you find that out? What data points do you compare yourself against in order to advocate for your staff? So we were hoping, and I was hoping that pulling together these job descriptions would be a starting point for that kind of research, right? It might be able to give an election official in that position kind of a rough way to determine what pay is appropriate for what kind of responsibilities are in a job description. But it's nowhere near the whole enchilada. It's just a piece of the puzzle, to do a very mixed metaphor there. And but I'm really hoping that some other researchers will be able to take this and follow up on it and help build that resource.
Thank you so much. I want to take a second. That link is posted in the chat that Will was mentioning that discusses sort of the press release on the research that is going to move forward through the EWOC and the Bipartisan Policy Center. Please take a look at that link. I think as practitioners, which is probably most of our audience today, you folks are going to be really interested in the kind of research and work that the EWOC and the Bipartisan Policy Center is doing with the support of the elections group to try to make to resolve these issues, to learn more about the elections workforce. So please take a look at that link. I want to pivot in just a moment to our audience questions, make sure we have time for those. So I'm just going to ask one more of my own question, and this is for both Paul and Will. A lot of our audience today is state or local election officials, and I just want to know, how can they take the research that you've done and either use it in their offices or how could they utilize it in their role as election officials?
So
Yeah, go for Will.
I would say that one thing that actually there are some researchers at the University of Maryland working on this kind of thing. Writing a job description that works and gets the applicants that you want is no easy task, right? So in addition to the data set that we've put together in terms of trying to understand compensation and what appropriate and fair compensation is, I'm also hoping that by pulling together all the election line job descriptions, this can kind of be useful to election officials who are trying to recruit and attract candidates. You can filter it by state or counties who you admire and who you think have done a good job staffing, and potentially use some of those job descriptions as a template. Um, Obviously, that's all the data set does. I would definitely reach out to election officials in jurisdictions whose work you admire to try to figure out some of the other pieces of how you recruit strong candidates. But hopefully, this is a data set of over 1,000 job descriptions that we think should be useful.
And just to add on, I hope that either the local election official survey or Will's data set help local jurisdictions make the case when it comes to budget season. So, if the compensation studies are a barrier or a challenge, this is another data point to say, look, we look at similarly sized jurisdictions and similar states. Here's what the pay ranges are. I hope that provides some data, some evidence to help make the case that compensation may need to change sort of at a local level if a local election official is going to their county budget hearings and budget board to work on that.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. Like I said, I want to pivot now, make sure I get to as many of our audience questions as possible. If for some reason we do not get to your question, like I said, feel free to email support@electionsgroup.com and either we'll get you an answer or we will try to reach out to Will and Paul to get you one. But let's jump in. So first question, I find it incredibly helpful to have this information and data collected over time to contextualize workforce and staffing issues. My question is this: do you think your findings on salary may help explain the turnover pattern that we've uncovered in another recent Bipartisan Policy Center report? So, Will, this seems like a natural one to kick to you first, and then we'll go to Paul.
Sure, yeah. And hopefully the elections group can link to this recent report that Paul Gronke referred to in the chat. Yeah, in April, we worked with two researchers from UCLA, Joshua Ferrer and Daniel M. Thompson, and Rachel Ory, our senior associate director, was the also an author on that report. And we found that election official turnover has been increasing steadily over the last few years and decades. It's not necessarily new, but it might be rising more today. As far as the Paul's question about does the findings on salary help explain the turnover patterns, that report was not necessarily like we didn't do like a causal analysis. We did some speculation in the report as to why turnover might be higher today. So, some speculation that increased hostility could be contributing. The roles are becoming increasingly complex, as Paul and I have talked about today. And also the workforce is just aging. So we didn't necessarily identify or speculate that flat salaries might be a contributor, but it's hard to imagine, frankly, that increased salaries wouldn't do a lot to incentivize people to stay in the role for longer. But I'm honestly just speculating, and I'm very happy to hand it back to Paul because Evik actually asks questions about the impact of salary on job satisfaction and things like that. So I think Paul has a lot more, can speculate a lot more about the causal factors of turnover than I can.
Yeah, I'm always a little bit surprised, and I think so in our survey, we do hear generally satisfaction with pay. And that's, of course, sort of on average across all of our respondents. And the reason I'm sort of pausing as I share that is I also know that there's a lot of discontent in some corners around how pay has been stagnant. So it's complex. And we know in public service, right, there's this idea of public service motivation. So individuals go into lower paid public jobs in part because there's some intangibles, right? There's civic duty. You're doing good work for the community. And we hear this over and over from local election officials. So we know that there's motivations that are more than just monetary for these individuals. That being said, I think to go back to the idea that these pressures are increasing and the compensation's not, I think is going to be a sustainability challenge going forward. We actually need to probably change this question in the survey. We do ask folks about their departure from, leaving the office. And we ask them about political climate, and we ask them about sort of enjoyment, but we don't ask them sort of because I'm not paid enough. And so maybe we need to add that in as sort of a component to say, hey, do you feel like the compensation is a reason to move on? Um, for the staff, that's going to be harder to get a sense of, and I do believe that there's probably more turnover dynamics there that are tied to pay than maybe at the chief position, where there's more of a commitment through the sort of civic duty and public service motivation. The staff may have more of a market choice. I can keep doing this job and the challenges with it, or I can pivot and move over to the sheriff's office, or I can pivot and move over, some other office within the county, make the same or more, and not have to sort of hear these sort of public concerns about my role in the election. So I worry about those at the staff level, but we don't really capture that. We don't know how to measure that right now.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And I feel like it's just like another, it's great to have these conversations because even if we don't know the answers, it might trigger for someone on the call who has the sort of like resources, connection, authority, to realize that like this is something we need to like be able to develop a little more information on, figure out more about, especially that group of folks, like you said, in the middle, between the head and the tail, the
Yeah.
line level staff. So next question we got is, are some of these trends also trends in other areas of local government, or do they seem like they're just specific to elections? And I'll hand that over to you first, Paul.
So this is a tough one for me. The data that I have available are the things that I tend to look at. One of the great data sources out there is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's EO4 report, which is what state and local governments report their pay and salary for both gender and race across the workforce. Their bands stop at $70,000 and sort of like 70,000 and above. And so, that policy tool is there to sort of understand what's happening for that line staff. And we do see that those are flat below the 70,000. Above 70,000 has a similar curve to what we find in the local election official survey over time. But that's just not the right sort of resolution, right? We're not getting the right numbers there. So my sense is that if I had to guess, I bet there are similar trends in local government sort of in terms of flatness, but the starting point for election pay is probably lower than some of the other comparable positions. But we can't quite measure that yet. And that's what I'd like to explore is the trends may be flat, but I think maybe election staff start at a lower number. And so there's sort of a catch-up question here as well.
Yeah, and I alluded to this question earlier in the talk as well. It's very hard to find uh, really comparable controls to election officials in other areas of local governments. I also, like Paul, would speculate that some of these trends are common to local government across the board. It's not just about pay, it's also about turnover, right? In the report that we put out, we found that turnover in election officials is increasing slightly over time. It's not like the crisis that you might see portrayed in newspapers necessarily, but it has been increasing over time. But maybe it's just a fact that people are spending less time in their positions in local government now for broad, uh, maybe these are broad trends across the entire labor market, right? But it's really hard to find comparable controls that are just like election officials in terms of, the work is very seasonal, right? It peaks around election season, and election years. And so there's definitely an opportunity for some more work here, and I think that would be fantastic if some researchers wanted to pick that up.
So, we have a few more questions. I'm going to try to get through as many of these as we can. But like I said, if we don't get to your question, we will make sure that we are able to. We'll answer these generally in the follow up to the webinar and make sure everybody gets their questions answered. Next one I have is, has there been any research done on seeing if geographic location is a predictor of more enhanced recruitment pipelines?
I don't know. I don't believe so. I think we're still wrestling with what the pipeline is, let alone getting to some regional variation.
Yeah, I've got not too much more to add other than that what the pipeline looks like for every jurisdiction looks radically different. I don't know if there are broad geographic trends that would be easy to identify.
Great. Okay, so next question is, how much are you finding that election officials feel they have agency over the hiring process, salaries, etc.? And how much are they saying you'll have to talk to our HR office?
And Danny, I'm peeking at the questions. I see Sky also has a similar sort of question here, and I think those two are linked. I mean, they almost answer them. What I've heard, and this is through the interview process, is that agency is a big challenge. So this is sort of a leadership question in many ways. I think I've heard a lot of challenges around compensation studies and the hiring practices. Compensation, I mean, one great story I remember hearing was there's a compensation study done, and it was during a busy period in the election cycle. So the election office really struggled to get data into the consultant doing that work, while all the other agencies in the county government were in a down period and they were happy to submit data. And so the consultant sort of looked at it, well, looks like, this election office didn't give us much stuff, so they must not do much. Versus we got all this data from all these other offices, and it was just sort of bad timing. And the consultant probably could have been a bit more aggressive learning about what happens. So, there was sort of a lack of agency. I do think some of the HR rules are a real challenge here. I'm always mindful, right? One person's red tape is another person's Bill of Rights, and we have these rules in place for different hiring and policy reasons. But at the same time, I have heard from election directors that, they're looking for different skill sets than what a standard boilerplate filtering screen from HR can capture. And so that has been a barrier. So, to that question, I think it is. I think it is. We don't know how pervasive, but I'm going to assume it's pretty pervasive as a challenge, and that there are some election officials who get creative. They might partner with another agency to help reclassify positions the same way to get some momentum through. But I think that is a challenge.
Awesome, excellent, thank you. And then Will, did you have anything to add there?
No, but I'm again, like Paul, just looking ahead in the Q&A, and there's a third and a fourth question on this same topic, right? Like very, aptly speculating that folks who are in a position to hire election officials are in many cases bound by their local government's rules, the pay scales and schedules. And this is something that I also hope that the data set will be able to be useful for, right? There's some we've heard from some local governments where, well, if the job includes cybersecurity responsibilities, that actually might be able to bump you into this next scale. And so that's something that again, you can maybe pull out from this job description data set, which is like how many of them mention cybersecurity. Does that put you in a higher pay scale, pay band? But that would require a researcher to look at, the rules by county and by state. And I think that would actually be really interesting to try to get a sense of, how much flexibility the folks who are in a position of hiring actually have.
Yeah, I think we probably only have time for about one more question. Like you said, well, a lot of our questions have similar themes, so I'm gonna ask one that I think maybe gives us an opportunity to talk about a few different issues. So, one of our questions was, your research shows flat salaries for LEOs over a period of time, but all election officials are expressing concern over additional job duties and increased scrutiny. How do you recommend we manage the review process with the salary study when duties have changed rapidly? And I'll even say when they've expanded in a lot of cases over the last few years, but comparables continue to show low pay. So I know that's a big question with a lot of parts, and parts might be easy to answer and parts might be impossible to answer. But I'm curious, Paul, Will, what you think.
I'm going to go, I'm moving out on a limb here because I'm not an HR expert, but I'll share sort of what I've heard. And I think for those offices that are struggling to sort of move the needle on these studies, one piece I've heard often is, unfortunately, some of these studies get hung up on the term clerk or recorder. Those titles is what they're searching for. So I think any way that an office can redefine some of those names even, or adding those duties, just as Will mentioned, if you've got some cybersecurity components or you've got some other IT pieces in there, that may help. I think that's really the challenge here, is that the comparables are not being very creative, and the nature of the work is not being captured appropriately. And so the challenge there is sort of how to highlight those terms. And actually, what might be helpful too, out of the data set that Will's created here is, can you sort of explore those common terms that may be an aha? Oh, we should slide this term in. I know I'm mindful when I do hiring. I'm often sort of a day late on thinking about some of my definitions for hiring. And so I know this is sort of another duty on top of duties, but if you can spend some time thinking ahead about what are some of those key terms that maybe come out of Will's data set that might move this out of what is getting sort of turned more clerical work and into the actually what it is, this very specialized, high compliance, high pressure work.
I agree with Paul. I think Paul touched on everything that I was going to say. The only thing I would say is that the comment says that the comparables continue to show and justify low pay, and I wouldn't necessarily like. I think as Paul's kind of getting at, I wouldn't necessarily resign yourself to the idea that the comparables justify low pay. I think the comparables are very diverse, and some of these positions are actually very seem actually quite well compensated. And I think it's a matter of pulling out which of what positions those are, why are they so well compensated, and also looking for comparables in other areas of local government besides election officials.
Will, Paul, we only have a few minutes left. So now I'd love to just give each of you a couple of minutes to make any closing remarks. Let's go ahead. We'll start with Paul.
Sure. Oh, thanks again for hosting this, Danny, and everybody, the election group. Appreciate the chance to share this. I think my closing comment would be actually a request for those that are attending, especially if you're an election official. I would love to hear from you. I think the challenge for a lot of us researching this work is, you have to really sort of do the work to understand it, and I haven't. And so the challenges that are ahead of you in terms of defining positions, the county processes for pay and budgeting. Let me know those stories. I'd love to hear from you all. Could we be asking questions better to get at this? Because really, at the end of the day, the goal for the Elections and Voting Information Center team and the LEO survey is to really use the survey as a way to elevate the voices of election administrators across the U.S. to participate in these policy debates. And so the more that we can hear from you about how we should better ask questions, I hope produces sort of a more policy relevant bit of data that help support your work as well. So reach out to us. I'll just close with one. I saw one question asking about the hours worked. We do ask that. And just let you know, 10% of election officials in the US say they work over 60 hours a week during peak periods in the election cycle, which doesn't shock me at all. And you probably all experience this. And another 20% are working overtime just in general. So we're seeing a third are really doing those hours. And I think that's something too that's not quite it's not something that'll be captured in a job description, but we know that sort of pressure is also a burnout element that we're not tracking and something we need to pay attention to.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul. That's a really important point to draw out too. I think any of us who has worked in the field knows that this is not a 40-hour a week job. It's way more than that, especially as you get closer to an election. And then Will, any final thoughts from you?
Sure. Yeah, I would also echo Paul in saying that if you have any questions about the data set that we've put together on the job descriptions, and it's again as publicly available. If you click on the link, Understanding the Election Official Job Market, there's a link there to a Google Sheets that has all of the job descriptions that have been posted to Election Line. Please poke around. If you have any issues with the methodology, any questions, I would love to hear from you and hear how we can make this data set more useful. So another thing I just wanted to say is that, we and the elections group through the Election Workforce Advisory Council have been studying recruitment, retention, and training. And I just wanted to flag that we have a really exciting new report that will be coming out this summer on the training piece specifically. So Grace Kleinfelter, who's an amazing project associate on our team, has been writing a report to look at how all 50 states in the U.S. do training for new election officials, for experienced election officials. She's been compiling all that. She's been doing a lot of interviews, maybe with some of you who are on this call right now, to try to show the very diverse ways that states across the country run their training programs. Who is available to attend them? Do they have some kind of like certification and things like that? And also, we are going to make recommendations for how to use a state level training program to optimally build up a workforce. So I just wanted to flag that for everybody. Put that on your radar, keep an eye out for it. And we're hoping that this will help with all of these components that we've been talking about how to professionalize the workforce and make sure that elections are administered well and that election officials, enjoy their jobs and stick around.
Thank you so much, Will and Paul. This was a really fun conversation. I can tell from the questions and the participation that the audience had a really fantastic time and learned a lot too. So thank you so much. And also, thank you to our audience. We really appreciate when you show up to these webinars. We love holding them. We hope that it was a very educational, informative, and hopefully enriching experience for you. That concludes our webinar. I just want to say thank you from the elections group. If you have any questions that did not get answered, or if you'd like to know more about Paul or Will's research, please feel free to send us an email at support@electionsgroup.com. And if your questions for Paul or Will, or if you want to get in contact with them, we'll facilitate that. We'll make sure you get a hold of them. So thanks again, everyone. Thank you, Paul and Will, and have a great day.